Good evening, everyone. I wanted to welcome you all to our first parent education webinar this month. My name is Gretchen Knob, and I'm the Regional Director of the Epilepsy Association of Western and Central Pennsylvania, working out of our Harrisburg area office. The Epilepsy Association provides programs and services to those living with and affected by epilepsy in 49 of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania. Our offices are located in Pittsburgh, Altoona, and the Harrisburg area. Our website will be in the chat if you would like to learn more about our organization or reach out to us. During these uncertain times, it is important for the Epilepsy Association to adapt and continue to provide our important services and programs to everyone. I want to thank you all for taking time out of the workshop. Tonight, we will be reviewing special education as well as discussing the impact of COVID-19 and school closures on those legal requirements and their implementation in schools. Okay, now I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Greg McConnell. He's the regional coordinator in our Altoona office, and he will be reviewing some housekeeping items.
Hey, thank you, Gretchen. First of all, again, thank you, and I want to echo what Gretchen said. We really appreciate you joining us here this evening. I wanted to spend just a minute or two going over some housekeeping items. I'll note that this presentation is being recorded, so if you don't want your name to show up or if you don't want to be shown on camera, you can keep that off. But if you don't want your name to show up, just type a note in the chat and I'll make sure that we black your name out before the recording goes out. This will be housed on our website, possibly social media sites, and maybe some learning management systems for future educational purposes. As I said, the cameras are off and you're muted, and the reason for that is to give everyone a more pleasurable viewing experience, to minimize background noise and all that kind of stuff. If you have any technical issues, you can call me at 814-799-0345, or you can type a message in the chat. We will be having a presentation by an attorney who I'm going to introduce in a minute. Prior to doing that, I want to encourage you to ask questions. And the way that we're going to do that, again, in order to have the best possible material being covered in the best possible way so that you all get something very good out of this, is that we're going to encourage you to type questions into the chat. Gretchen and I will be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and then at the end of the presentation, when our presenter is finished speaking, we'll open up and have the question and answer period. The presentation file will be in the chat area, so if you want to take that for viewing later to print out, you can do that. With that said, it is our pleasure and honor to welcome attorney Nancy Potter as our presenter this evening. Nancy is an attorney in McAndrews Law Offices, PC, in their Western Pennsylvania office located in Pittsburgh. Nancy's practice includes cases in all major areas of education advocacy, with a focus on special education and enforcing the education rights of the most vulnerable students. Nancy provides legal representation to students and families from early intervention through post-secondary education in the areas of special education, education civil rights, student discipline, and enrollment of special populations. She provides training, advocacy, materials, and technical assistance on education law to parent and student groups, lawyers, activists, and service providers, and is a frequent guest lecturer at area universities and law schools. Nancy graduated from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and received her undergraduate degree from Oklahoma State University. She served as a judicial law clerk to Honorable Oliver J. Lobaugh. Prior to joining McAndrews Law Offices, Nancy was a supervising attorney at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, where she led a team working to promote educational excellence through vigorous enforcement of civil rights in our nation's schools. Nancy also previously worked as a staff attorney at the Education Law Center and represented abused, neglected, and at-risk youth at Kids Voice. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here today, for letting me be a part of this, and for including me in this learning series that you're doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the alphabet soup that you're going to hear from me as we go through this presentation. I think most of you are familiar with these terms, but I just want to make sure everyone knows a few of the acronyms that we'll use. The first one, FAPE, Appropriate Public Education. That's the guarantee to our students with disabilities under the Individuals with Disabilities and So we have FAPE, IDEA, and then we'll talk about IEPs, our individual education programs or plans that we use to lay out the way our students are going to receive FAPE in their school. So the way this presentation is structured is I'm going to do the most frequently asked questions that we've been receiving over the past almost 3 months now, since COVID and distance learning have all become a part of our lives every day. And as was said previously, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, through them at the end of the presentation. So first of all, do school districts even have to provide FAPE, or do IEP meetings and complete evaluations anymore? And the answer to that question is unequivocally yes. So the United States Department of Education provided guidance right off the bat, saying that if a school district was closed and not providing any instruction to any student, then those schools were under no obligation to provide FAPE to special education students during that period of closure. However, if a school district was able to provide direct instruction to students, then all students, regardless of whether they were eligible for FAPE or not. Now, fairly quickly, the U.S. Department of Education came out about 10 days later and clarified that guidance and said, hey, school districts, you cannot decide just not to provide services to any student because you think providing FAPE to eligible students would somehow create liability or be an impediment. So where we're at right now is that both the federal government and the state government have said, school districts, you have to provide something, and you have to make sure that students with disabilities eligible under their IEPs are still getting their programs and services consistent with the IDEA. A big part of that is timelines, IEP meetings, all those other things that we have timelines on. And if anybody's following along on the slides, we're on slide 4. Timelines for the completion of our evaluations, reevaluations have absolutely not been waived. So evaluations, reevaluations, and IEPs should be completed consistent with our timelines. Now, certain testing, of course, cannot be administered remotely, and of course, classroom observations are very challenging to do in a virtual setting. But evaluators can still review student records and available progress data. They can interview parents, they can interview teachers and students. They can still administer rating scales. So rating scales are oftentimes sent home to parents and students and teachers, where you have a series of questions about the student to rate them on various skills or issues. All of those things can still be completed remotely, as well as other assessments. But I think I'm back. Okay. Do school districts have to provide interim evaluations? So a lot of school districts are. What we're seeing is districts are issuing interim evaluations or interim reevaluations based on the types of information I just mentioned that are easy to assess, with a commitment to complete other testing and more observation once schools reopen, and then they can issue an amended report. Now, we already know by federal regulation, participation in any meetings and any IEP meetings can be held remotely via telephone or video conference. And I would just encourage all of you and empower all of you to ask for what works best for you. If you're not comfortable on Zoom, if that's not something that you want to do, or using some sort of video conferencing, and that's what the school has set up, it is completely okay to say, you know what, I need to do this by phone. The most important thing is that you're participating in a way that you feel. You should definitely not be hearing from anyone, we can't until we can get back in person, and we're suspending all evaluations until we can get back in person. Neither of those things are true. And what I'm seeing are schools, professionals, internal, external professionals, parents and students working together to come up with some creative solutions. I just had a client today complete an occupational therapy assessment related to handwriting. And we were able to have that performed virtually. Who are receiving 504 services. So if you or the really gives students with disabilities their civil rights. That's our civil rights law. The ID specifics about how education should work for students with disabilities, how IEPs work, but it's really a grant statute, whereas our civil rights statute. Now, some students are eligible for 504 because they have they're not disabilities that make them eligible for an IEP or don't make them eligible for protections under that. Just like students, though, with IEPs, students who have Section 504 plans should certainly continue to be receiving those services during distance learning. Again, to the extent our materials are being provided to students with 504 plans are entitled to have their accommodations and supports implemented. That certainly includes related services. So that can be occupational therapy, physical therapy, counseling, anything like that that's provided to your child through a Section 504 plan, as well as accommodations, extended time, frequent breaks, and large materials. Now, I also want to note that you may be in a situation where you have an IEP or a Section 504 plan that's not really working right now. Maybe your student needs more frequent breaks because being in front of the screen all day has some negative effect on their ability to engage in their education. Maybe your student's experiencing some increased anxiety, and while he had previously only been doing counseling once a month, maybe that needs to be more often. Is requiring students to sit in class at the same time, synchronized learning as part of a live class for 45 minutes or an hour, when due to your own child's brain, he or she should only be sitting in front of a computer, never longer than 30 minutes. So if you're in a situation where your child or your student needs accommodations that are different than what they were receiving when we were all back in February sitting in class together, this is a great opportunity to ask for an IEP meeting, to email your special education team or email your 504 coordinator and ask and request those changes to accommodation. And you can even, we'll talk more later, but you can even say, for the duration of COVID-related distance learning, these additional accommodations apply. So don't feel like you're stuck necessarily trying to fit that square peg of your IEP or Section 504 plan from prior to COVID into this round hole that we're now living in. Those documents should be living documents. They should be flexible. And your team from the school should be able to work with you to be nimble, to be able to address the needs that your child has right now in this current educational situation. We've also gotten questions about vocation and work-based programs. So students who are in career and technical education programs, CTEs, or maybe some vocational or work-based classroom work or training. Now, everything that I just said about regular classroom work certainly applies to vocational work-based programming. Of course, remote learning may be more challenging. So for example, I'm working with a family where the student is in an auto mechanics course. And the auto mechanics course at this point, was the students working hands-on underneath the hood of a car, learning how to do that vocation. And so, of course, that can be a little bit more challenging, and the accommodations received can be a bit more challenging. But again, what we're finding is that certain aspects of students' program can certainly be done virtually, It can be done through different online platforms. So again, creative solutions, but the answer shouldn't be a brick wall. Nope, we can't do anything. We're just not going to be able to do that part of the student's program anymore. The answer should be, to the extent that there are direct classroom-based instructions or other work or vocation skills that are possible to continue, that instruction continue remotely, whether it's through video conferencing, viewing videos, whatever that looks like in this situation. The next thing I want to talk about is parent training. Now, the frequently asked question we get is not, what about parent training? The frequently asked question we get is, what is the one right that I have under the IDEA or the IEP that you think everybody forgets about or is the most underused? And oftentimes my answer is parent training. So parents are entitled to parent training. That is a related service that can go into your IEP. Sorry, just my Zoom blinked on me again. The parent training is a related service under the IDEA. It's really training provided by the school district or through the school district to assist the parent in meeting their child's educational needs. Now, that training could be provided by your child's teacher, a classroom teacher, some other educator or professional at the school, include some outside person teaching a parent academic, functional, or behavioral techniques that could benefit your child. Sometimes also includes direct consultation with you regarding your specific child. Requests for parent training should be made to your child's IEP team. Now, for us in this world of distance learning, most often what I'm seeing parents ask for are, students who use assistive technology throughout their school day. Maybe it's something that's really only been used in the school setting and not in the home setting. And so parents can get parent training on how to utilize that assistive technology to be able to ensure their child is making the progress they need to be making academically in an online learning environment. In addition, if you have a child who maybe has some behavioral needs that are being addressed through an IEP, oftentimes what we find is that people in the school have done some specific trainings about how to approach that student, your support plan. And again, parent training is there to help parents learn about what are those techniques that are being used at school. We've even done some parent training in our IEPs around teaching occupational therapy, how to support occupational therapists as that student is receiving those services. So again, if there's something going on that you as the parent feel like you don't know how to do and you're not comfortable with, even if it's something like Zoom, like you're uncomfortable using the web-based platform, maybe they use Blackboard or something similar and you don't understand how to use it, you can request through your IEP team parent training and you're entitled to that under the IDEA. Again, I would just encourage you to IEP team or your Section 504 coordinator and say, I need to make a request for parent training. Here's the problem I'm having. Can we include that in the IEP moving forward? And we've heard some questions from parents who are homeschooling their students. And unfortunately, at this time, no guidance has been provided regarding the impact of school closures on homeschooling, particularly as it relates to the state requirements to submit portfolios or program evaluations. Some parents are concerned about next school year, whether or not there's going to be a plan in place, which the State Department of Education, if you don't know, Pennsylvania Department of Education did put out some guidelines earlier today about going back to school. There are people who are new to homeschooling who are evaluating this as an option for next year. And again, we really don't have any guidance yet on how to meet those needs or how things are changing. If you've been providing, the home education program previously and serving as a supervisor, then I would just encourage you to continue to submit your portfolio, continue to, comply with the laws and regulations that you've. If you're relying on someone else or an organization in the past to provide that, or need someone else to evaluate the program, I would suggest reach out to your school district or your local IU, or alphabet soup, that's your intermediate unit, which is a regional support center for educational institutions. But you could reach out to them and ask them if you could have an extension of a timeline, or whether they might be able to recommend a way to evaluate your program virtually or remotely. We've also got lots of questions about counseling services. The students who receive counseling services as part of their 504 plan or IEP, whether or not they should be made up later or they should be ongoing right now. Fortunately, people in our mental health professions have been really on the cutting edge of telemedicine. And so we would expect that almost all counseling services could continue via teletherapy, either by telephone or video conference. You know, in many cases, the amount of therapy for our students is remaining the same. Maybe you need more or less services than what they were receiving before. So if you are a student who has a lot of anxiety around going to school and social anxiety and being in groups and crowds, and all of a sudden you don't have to do that anymore, that's alleviated, you know, there may be an opportunity to use that time for something else. But maybe you're a student who, on the other hand, is experiencing increased anxiety because of what's going on, and perhaps you need more access to counseling services. I would strongly encourage you, you know, any increase or decrease in services should be a decision made by the IEP team. Increase a service, and really this is across the board, but certainly for counseling services, if you're asking to decrease something while we are in this distance learning mode, I would just encourage you to include wording saying that you're only requesting it for, you know, the next 60 days or until we resume regular in-school learning environment. You don't want to give up services that you know you're going to need when we get back to whatever normal is. So just be careful with your language there. We've received lots of questions actually from advocates who represent or work with students who are incarcerated, whether those are students incarcerated in an adult or a youth prison facility. In general, the IDEA has really narrow modifications of the student rights for youth who are incarcerated. The biggest one being that programming decisions can be based on a bona fide security or compelling interest for students incarcerated in adult prisons. Sometimes people will try to apply that to students in youth prisons as well. So what we've seen are many prisons and jails, most likely our younger students are in jails, most often the ones we've talked to, but they're asking for permission or forgiveness for exceeding timelines or any sort of education that typically requires an in-person appearance at the facility. However, I think it's really important to remember, and if you don't already know, is many of these facilities have really advanced and lots of video conferencing equipment, because oftentimes courts, to save money transporting individuals back and forth between facilities and the courthouse, have already implemented video conferencing as part of their environment. So there should be, not that every system is compatible with another system, this is actually a place where we would say there should already be a lot of resources available to continue education for the students. And it could certainly be leveraged for any advocates or parents trying to ensure that their student who they're working with, who's incarcerated, is able to access their education continually. Another question that we've gotten, and this is kind of a frequently asked question overall, but people will say to us, what's a prior written notice and what's a notice of recommended educational placement? Again, alphabet soup, PWN, or what we call a NORA. Really, they're just different names for the same things. In other states, or if you've moved to Pennsylvania recently, you would have gotten they do them separately, a PWN and a NORA. But in Pennsylvania, they're usually just tied all together into one thing. School districts and charter schools are required to provide those that prior written notice of when they're going to be proposing an educational program for a student. under the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. Like you see there on the slide, different states call it different things. Primary difference is in title. If a school wants to put your child somewhere, they need to tell you where they're going to put them, is generally what those two documents mean. We've also received lots of questions about, okay, we hear what you're saying about doing evaluations and doing them remotely, but are those really valid? And if I end up having to go to due process or do something further, is evidence to get what I'm trying to fight for my child? So we break the impact of the school shutdowns and social distancings on these types of assessments for our students into 4 rough categories. So the first one is data review. All assessments under the IDEA are to start with data review, and therefore all evaluations during shutdown can and should still include this component. Our school districts are required to keep electronic records. Everyone should have access to those. It shouldn't require necessarily going into a school building or an office. The data review, the first thing that should always happen, should still be happening for any sort of evaluation or assessment. The second thing are rating scales. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but many assessments include rating scales by teachers and parents and students themselves. Rating scales, again, sheet of paper emailed to you, mailed to your home, where it asks you to rate yourself or the student on various skills and activities. Those can certainly be completed remotely. Caveat that some of the skills say it needs to be based on the person filling it out, the rater's knowledge of the child from the past month. If that's the case and the teacher completes a scale more than 1 month after they've seen the child, then that really needs to be indicated in the report and on the scale itself as a possible deviation from standard administration. It should not be a barrier to completing the administration of the assessment, but we want to note that it's different than what you would typically expect. But again, if a teacher's having daily remote contact, we want to note that. If the teacher is just sending home packets and hasn't spoken to the child in over a month, then we want to note that. But we still want to keep doing those rating scales. The third kind of rough category are assessments that we know can be completed over video conferencing software. So the professional groups representing publishers and school psychologist groups have already promulgated guidance among themselves for practitioners about how to administer these assessments over video. The appropriateness of an assessment over video, what you're trying to measure, the testing conditions, both for the student and the evaluator, and whether the evaluator can actually establish some rapport with the student. Again, any assessments that are done over video conferencing, we want to note in our reports, our final reports that we get, that it was done in a different way or that it was completed virtually. But I can tell you, I've seen already great success with these virtual assessments. And, what could this mean for some students outside of our distance learning situation is, for those of you who are in very rural counties, where you're thinking sometimes to get an assessment, you're going to have to go a couple of hours and maybe there's an overnight. I think this really opens up the opportunity for parents and families, if it's right for them, to request doing some sort of virtual assessments in the future. And then the last category are there's just no way that they can be administered unless it's in face-to-face testing arrangements. As I mentioned briefly earlier, if such an assessment is needed that has to be face-to-face, the IEP team and the evaluator, if it's an outside evaluator, should discuss the merits of either issuing a partial report followed later by an addendum once schools reopen, or B, postponing any report. At McAndrews, we're encouraging clients to lean towards the former. That is, to go ahead and have a partial report and ask for it to be updated once schools are back open. We think that could be particularly useful in programming for a student during these very challenging and new circumstances. But there's certainly situations where an evaluator simply does not have sufficient information to make recommendations and findings and needs to wait until face-to-face tests are completed. So as far as validity, any of the assessments that are administered appropriately in any of those categories 1 through 3 that I talked about will be valid. The question is, are we getting sufficient and enough information to program for the student? And if not, then you just want to make sure that when schools reopen or even when facilities reopen, that we're able to complete that additional testing. Okay, so what about what services can I ask for and what do I do if the district says no? You know, this question is something that comes up a lot now, but really this is a question we so frequently get asked, even outside of this distance learning situation. So first of all, districts should be, and I think most districts are, working to provide as close to comparable services as possible via remote means. If a service can be provided via video chat, teletherapy, or phone calls, districts need to be providing it. If the district says no to such a request, we recommend these kind of 3 steps. So first, ask questions. What if instead of video, we tried a phone call check-in? I heard other districts are doing it. I know that some speech therapy is happening by video chat. Can we try that? Why do you think that won't work? What are the barriers to it? You know, you want to ask questions to figure out exactly why the school is saying no. Number 2, respectfully noting your disagreement. And I'm a big fan of doing these things by email to have them in writing. So maybe your response after they say no and you've asked questions is, I will have to, you know, we might have to agree to disagree, but I would like for you to note my disagreement in our meeting notes, perhaps if that's during a virtual IEP meeting. And then work your way up the food chain, so to speak. If you're told no by your classroom teacher, you know, they just might be constrained by what they think are institutional rules. So contact the special ed coordinator in the school building. If that doesn't work, then go to the special ed director and move up through the ladder of people, because oftentimes, you know, it's a barrier. Get up to the person who's created the barrier, they can remove it. Overall, you know, we think it's best to be respectful and flexible, but also be really clear and strong about what it is you feel your child's needs are. Again, put it down in writing when you can, and it may help you be able to articulate what your question is or what it is that you have a problem with. If the district continues to refuse services that you feel are possible, again, just make a note that the next time when school reopens and you're able to get back to doing an IEP meeting, that you want to talk about compensatory services when schools reopen. Speaking of compensatory services, we've gotten lots of questions about what is that? What does compensatory services look like? So under the IDEA, that federal law that gives our students with disabilities the right to a free and appropriate public education of FAPE, it says when students aren't provided that, the school must reimburse them through compensatory education. We call it comp ed usually for short. So most often, if you're not familiar with it, it's either services or money given for specific educational services provided to a student to make up for what they lost. So the U.S. Department of Education has said, with regard to our current distance learning and school closures, that once schools reopen, districts need to make individual determinations whether and to what extent compensatory services may be needed, consistent with any requirements, including to make up for skills that may have been lost. They haven't provided any more guidance about what those determinations look like. But I just want to note that this is really important, because number one is saying that schools cannot say, all right, every student who had an IEP has to do extended school year next year, or every student that had an IEP is going to do 2 extra hours of classroom learning on Saturday mornings. You know, that's a blanket rule, and it has to be an individualized determination. The other piece that's important is that making up for any skill that has been lost. Well, how are you going to know what skills have been lost? What I'm encouraging my clients to do is just to keep track. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. It doesn't have to be pretty or perfect, but maybe keep a notebook on your kitchen counter, and at the end of the week, write down, my child was receiving speech therapy for articulation issues around the letter R. And while the first couple of weeks after school shut down, he continued to make progress, at this point, I notice he's regressing. If it's behavioral, whatever it is, just jot yourself a few notes down. I have one client who writes it on a dry erase board and takes a picture of it and emails it to me to keep a record. It's really progress monitoring your own child in a way. But again, we're just wanting to keep track so that we know what skills may have been lost or may have regressed. So we expect that districts will be expected to hold IEP meetings when students return to school, that at those meetings, the school will need to assess for each student whether they need to offer additional educational services to make up for any services not provided or skills that were lost. The compensatory services could be offered, like I said, as an increase in services provided by the district, or in comp ed funds where the money goes into a specific kind of trust, so students can use that money to be reimbursed or able to access additional services outside the school day. Another piece of our alphabet soup that I have alluded to is ESY. ESY stands for Extended School Year. And oftentimes when we think of extended school year, we think of students who are eligible for summer school because they show regression over school break. And while it is certainly true that summer school can be ESY, it also mean a longer school day or tutoring over the weekend during the school year or spring break or winter break. So ESY is much broader than just summer school. The impact of school closures on what ESY looks like this summer will really depend on when schools can reopen. So if schools actually, some schools are saying they may be able to reopen by July 1st, students may see more standard ESY services, which should still be individualized, or schools may seek to use those dates up to make up instructional time for the whole student body. We just don't know yet. We're waiting to see whether schools try to use this time to deliver some of the compensatory services that we just talked about. If school closures do last through the summer, which they may in some districts, ESY summer services, will be less relevant right now. But for students who do experience those significant regressions during the closure, again, we want to encourage you and empower you to talk to your district about extended school year services over shorter breaks, fall and winter breaks, maybe weekend tutoring, maybe an extended hour after school, to help the student begin to regain that lost ground. We've gotten lots of questions about how to respond to NORCs or documents from the school district asking the family to waive their right to FAPE. Parents aren't sure how to respond to those. And again, this is some general advice, though every determination can be very individual. You want to make sure that any NORC you receive indicates that the plan for distance learning is temporary. That is an interim plan, and that your student's plan will revert back to the last IEP when schools reopen. You want to be on the lookout for any indication that the district regards your agreement as a waiver of your child's right to a free, appropriate public education or to a FAPE during this time. If you see anything concerning along these lines, saying that you're waiving it, saying that, not saying that it's temporary, but you still want to move forward with implementing the distance learning plan or receiving some services, you can go ahead and sign the document and write near your signature, I agree to the implementation of the distance learning plan temporarily, but not to its appropriateness. That should protect you. I also wanted to say that this isn't true for all students. So I am working with some clients who the NORC proposed for distance learning is actually what we wish their regular school year looked like. So in those cases, maybe you don't want it to be temporary. So I give this general advice, which applies to almost everybody, but just want to note that individual circumstances may vary. And then the last thing I wanted to talk to you all about today are specific examples of accommodations that we're seeing for students with epilepsy. For some students with epilepsy, they may miss school due to seizure activity or even medical appointments. So one accommodation that could be asked for is a plan to reduce or delay assignments or tests. A student may need to be seated in proximity to a teacher so that that teacher can observe any sort of seizure activity. So preferential seating. And I can tell you, I just had a meeting this week with a student whose IEP previously had said, front row seating, because in their school building, teachers' desks were typically in the front row. And that student felt a lot of anxiety and nervousness being in the front row where everyone could see him. And so a creative teacher actually moved his desk to kind of the back side of the classroom, and that student was then able to sit there where he felt more comfortable asking for help, felt less self-conscious if he did have some seizure activity. The teacher was right there able to observe as needed. Absence from seizures that occur during instruction can cause students to miss important information. So students may need to have accommodations written in that require reteaching, tutoring, or extra assistance. Again, always good to have these things written in there from the beginning instead of waiting and seeing if you need them. Some students that I've worked with have specific stimuli that can trigger seizures. So whether that's stress, flashing lights, loud noises, or excessive screen time, which we're seeing a lot right now, students might require accommodations to allow them to opt out of situations that could trigger seizures. If you're at school, a quiet place to test or study. Right now, a lot of it is how do we minimize excessive screen time for our students. Consistent homeschool communication and frequent progress monitoring, again, that helps identify and address the effects epilepsy is having on the student's learning, and also the effect that distance learning is having on the student's epilepsy. So if you've noticed, an uptick in seizure activity related to the increase of screen time with distance learning, that's something you want to be noting. And then if at some point next year, we again end up in a situation where we're distance learning, you're prepared to ask for some accommodations to your child's schedule. Some other accommodations that we frequently see is the ability to go to a nurse at the student's request. Some students are nervous to say that out loud, to go to their teacher and say, I need to go to the nurse, or have to raise their hand and ask in front of a class. So oftentimes with my clients, I'll ask that the school give them a little red note card or orange note card that they can keep in their desk or their backpack or their pocket, and they can just pull it out and show the teacher, and then the teacher can walk over and say, okay, you're excused to go to the nurse. The other thing is, we talked about parent training being a big part of IEPs that's often overlooked. Another thing that can be in an IEP or Section 504 plan is actually requiring training for the staff. So you could ask for and request training for staff on how to spot a seizure, what to do in response, what stimuli to be on the lookout for, all of those things. Sorry, I have two little boys with me right now. All of those things can be included. And then, of course, implementing a seizure response plan, either including that in the IEP itself or as some sort of an addendum to an IEP or a Section 504. So that was a pretty quick overview of the frequently asked questions that we're seeing over the past few months. And I wanted to make sure we spent a little time specifically talking about students with epilepsy. I'm happy to answer as helpful as we can be. On that last slide, you have all of our contact information for our offices. You can see we're all over Pennsylvania, District of Columbia, and Delaware. I'm out here in Pittsburgh. I moved to Pittsburgh last summer. I should say I moved back to Pittsburgh last summer after serving at the Office for Civil Rights to open this office. And we're happy to serve families in Western, Southwestern, Northwestern, and Central Pennsylvania from our Pittsburgh office. And if you call, you'll get through to me. You can also always email me. My email address is npotter@mcandrewslaw.com. If we can be helpful with questions or anything at all that we can do, we are here. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions we've received from families while I was lecturing.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, very much. I appreciate that. We have a couple of questions that came in. The first one is from Mia Carlino, and it reads, remote learning is not full immersion. With that in mind, the assignments require being on different apps throughout the day. I need the lesson objective in order to break it down to content my son can grasp. Also, the screen time required to complete the assignments is not good for his brain. Can I request books?
Okay, great. Let me break that into the separate questions, and I'm going to do it backwards. So, can I request books? Absolutely. And I would certainly make those requests. You could have that built into a Section 504 plan or an IEP, but you could also just ask, and I would do that. Ask quickly and explain why. In order for my child to access his education and receive, if he's a student with an IEP, FAPE under the IDEA, he needs books, hard copy, whatever books, to provide those. Being provided the lesson objective, again, absolutely. That's a request to the IEP team that the teachers would provide the lesson objective or breaking things down in content chunking for you. So those are some words that you might want to use. Absolutely, you can ask for that, and schools should be providing that. Some people, I know that lots of students are having to struggle with this jumping between the different apps and the different kind of interfaces. And again, if that's too much or overwhelming for the student, you can address that through an IEP or with the IEP team. But if it's also, I can tell you, I have 2 young students, and I get overwhelmed at all the different programs that we're using. And I actually did have their teacher do just a short training for me to learn how to use some of it. So again, that parent training can be really important.
Okay, thank you. Move on to the next question is from Renee Miller. It reads, my daughter did not qualify in the beginning of the school year for ESY. However, I am definitely seeing regression in many areas. Do I ask to be included? Therapies are not what they were in school. I am understanding and flexible with this COVID break, but seeing more regression than I had hoped for.
So yes, ask to be included. My advice would be to reach out to the IEP team and say, I understand that, my child wasn't eligible when we made ESY determinations. Those are usually made in February. I understand my child wasn't eligible at that time. However, I'm seeing these regressions, and, provide the data that you have for what those regressions are as specific as you can be, but doesn't have to be sophisticated. It doesn't have to be scientific, because you, parent, are the #1 expert on what you're seeing from a regression standpoint with your child, and your observations of that regression under the law are absolutely valid data. So tell the school what you're seeing and what the problems are, and ask for a reconsideration of ESY, and whether those ESY services, and that you'd like for some of those ESY services to start during extended breaks the upcoming school year instead of waiting until the summer to start ESY. And quite frankly, if right now you say, oh, I know my school is going to start an ESY program on July 15th, and even though I wasn't eligible previously, I'd like for them to reconsider that, reach out to the IEP team, make that an ask of the IEP team, and see where they go from there. But I think that's a very reasonable ask, and we're certainly seeing some schools already start to.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Another question came in from Megan Ryle. I have been asking for the school to get training by the Epilepsy Center, but the school has not done it. Tell me more about putting the training in his IEP.
Sure. So if you look at your IEP, or if you go onto the state website, PATTAN, P-A-T-T-A-N, if you're familiar with them, they have an annotated IEP, which is basically a blank IEP with notes about what all the different pieces mean. And in there's training for professionals. That's a part of the IEP. And you can have explicitly written into the IEP, who's going to get the training, who's going to give the training, how often the training is going to happen. Again, it's part of the IEP team decision. It goes into the paper document. I've worked with families where we requested, training for the classroom teacher. I've worked with families where we requested training for the security guards. And we were able to get that into the IEP. Again, it's something that's underutilized. If you pull out your student's IEP tonight or tomorrow and flip through it, you'll find that part. And that's where it goes. And I would just make a written request for an for it to be included in the IEP, or for an IEP team meeting to discuss why it isn't being included.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Another question from Renee Miller came in. Another quick question. My daughter has also been set up with the Empatica Embrace bracelet. Do I add an accommodation for this? She has a full-time nurse that goes to school with her that will manage, but it tends to get tricky when her nurse calls off. Suggestions?
Absolutely. I think, if your child's using any sort of assistive technology like that, even if the school's not providing it, including the use of that assistive technology in the IEP is really important. Sometimes we don't do that because, we have a great teacher or there's a great nurse in the building, but when that person's gone, we lose that. So we want to make sure we're getting that in writing. I would put the accommodation in the IEP. And I think, it might be worthwhile thinking about whether there's people in the building who need to be trained about the Empatica Embrace bracelet in case her nurse isn't there.
Okay, thank you very much. There are no other questions in right now. If anyone has any questions, if you could please type them into the chat. Anything follow up to another question from Megan came back in. Megan Ryle, one of my son's huge triggers is heat. His school is not air conditioned. Does the school have to accommodate?
So, the school has to make reasonable accommodations. I have certainly argued in the past successfully that a student who had, a severe trigger to heat or allergens or something, if that was a student, and the two times I'm thinking that I've done this with clients have been young students who were in a singular classroom. Got the school to, agree to put basically a window unit. For another student, it was like an ionizer air purifier for the room that he was in. So yes, there's definitely options for accommodations. I would come to the table with solutions, specific things like, here's what my child needs to be able to access education in the school. And can you ask for the school to put in a full air conditioning system? You could ask. I don't think that a hearing officer or the ADEA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, would require them to do that. But asking for a unit in the room that he's in, the unit that he's in most often, or, I've had other students where we say, if it gets too hot, excuse me, the student can have a timeout to go cool off in the nurse's station where we know there's an air conditioning unit, like that. And let me just say one other thing about that, which happens a lot here in Pittsburgh, and I know it happens a lot in Philadelphia as well. The students with asthma, when there's a high pollution day in Pittsburgh, or when they put out an air alert for Philadelphia, we have written into IEPs and 504 plans that those don't count as absences for those students, that they're allowed to be educated at home that day and don't have to go in. So you might also want to say that any absences, when the temperature outside is over a certain amount, don't count as absences for him. Those are just days that he's allowed to learn from home. Might be another creative solution.
Okay, a follow-up from Megan. Also, if he has to be homebound again, is it possible legally for him to Skype into the classroom or some type of virtual learning?
So I do this really annoying thing when horrible things happen and always look for the silver lining. which sounds endearing, but when you're around me all the time, I understand from people that it's a little much. But I had just said the other day that I think this is one of the silver linings of finding ourselves in this distance learning situation, is that we're all seeing and experiencing how to include virtual learning or, using Skype or Zoom on a regular basis. So I think, yes, absolutely. If your student has to be homebound, and there's instruction going on in the classroom that they're missing out on, I think you can certainly request that the school allow him to Skype in for that, or ask that the school record it. We have repeatedly said and continue to feel comfortable saying that both of those things are consistent with FERPA, the Federal Education Records Privacy Act. So most often schools will say, oh, we can't do that because of FERPA. I just don't think that's true. And I think that COVID and distance learning have shown us that there are creative solutions, and our students who are receiving instruction in the home or are homebound should still be able to participate in parts of the regular school day via video. And if you need magic words to use, I would say, in order for my child to access the least restrictive learning environment, LRE, you should utilize video software to allow him to Skype into the class. And I think that that is a really strong argument, legal argument, that they should be providing access to the classroom virtually for our students who are homebound or receiving instruction in the home.
Okay, there are no more questions that came in. At this time, I'll turn it over to Gretchen if you have anything that you want to say in closing.
Just wanted to thank everyone again for taking the time out to join us. Especially, I'd like to thank Nancy. She stepped in graciously to do this presentation for us at the last minute due to some unforeseen circumstances. So we really appreciate it. She did a great job. And Greg, I'd like to thank you for all of your help moderating everything. I hope that you all stay safe and healthy. And thank you again for joining us.